The taste of vintage champagne was a poison I couldn't swallow. It sat heavy and cloying on my tongue, like the metallic tang of a dying battery. My fingers trembled against the stem of the crystal flute, borrowed, like the designer heels and the man who was supposed to be standing beside me. As the orchestra played a waltz for a ghost, every upbeat note felt like an accusation. Every pitying look from the socialites in the front row was a needle under my skin. I checked the phone hidden in the folds of my red velvet gown. The notification burned like a brand against my palm. Account seized, federal hold. My breath hitched. This wasn't just a jilted bride's humiliation. This was a calculated execution. I looked toward the ballroom's gilded entrance and felt the wrongness in the air, the way the shadows of the caterers were too rigid, their eyes scanning the room for a target. The ballroom doors exploded inward. The sound reverberated through the crystal-draped hall like a gunshot, silencing every laugh, every clink of silverware. Heads snapped toward the entrance in a single terrified motion. Even the federal agents reaching for my wrists froze. He entered like a storm given human shape, tall, broad-shouldered, flanked by two men whose black suits were so stiff they looked like Kevlar armor. But it was the man in the center who stopped my heart. His tuxedo was midnight black, the kind of silk that absorbed the light of the chandeliers, and his face was a masterpiece of chiseled, predatory beauty, all sharp bone structure and cold, unwavering intent. But it was his neck that made my blood turn to ice. Beneath the stark white of his collar, black ink curled upward, the jagged tail of a dragon, the mark of the Lim Syndicate. He was the monster the finance world whispered about in hushed tones, and he was walking straight for me. The chaos of the ballroom was a discordant symphony of shouting agents and crashing crystal. The lead FBI agent's hand was a cold, iron vice around my wrist, the metal of the handcuffs glinting under the strobing emergency lights. I was a forensic accountant. I lived in a world of balanced equations and predictable outcomes. But as I looked into the lens of a dozen hovering press cameras, the math of my life finally hit zero. Then the air in the room shifted, growing heavy and still. Lim Kyung-Tae moved through the wreckage of my reception with the predatory grace of a man who owned the ground he walked on. He didn't look at the agents or the terrified socialites. His focus was a laser point, fixed entirely on me. "Step back, Agent Miller," Kyung-Tae said. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a resonant, chilling authority that made the agent's grip falter. "Stay out of this, Lim," the agent hissed, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of hesitation. "Devyn Taylor is under federal arrest for the embezzlement of $50 million. We have the warrants." Kyung-Tae stepped into the light, the dragon on his neck appearing to writhe as he tilted his head. He reached into the breast pocket of his charcoal gray suit and pulled out a single gold-crested document. He held it up, not for the agent to take, but for everyone to see. "Your warrant is for a Miss Devyn Taylor," Kyung-Tae remarked, his eyes like polished obsidian. "But this woman is Devyn Lim. We were married in a private civil ceremony at dawn this morning. Under the laws of marital privilege and the sovereign protection of my estate, you'll need a much higher clearance and a new warrant to touch her." I stared at the document. My own signature stared back at me, a perfect, elegant forgery that looked more real than my actual handwriting. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that Kyung-Tae seemed to feel as he reached out, his hand sliding firmly around my waist. "She's coming with me," he stated. It wasn't a request. He pulled me behind the wall of his chest, shielding me from the flashes of the cameras as his men formed a phalanx of impenetrable black suits. The agent stood frozen, paralyzed by the legal nightmare Kyung-Tae had just dropped in their laps. He guided me toward the exit, his touch possessive and grounding. Outside, the night air was sharp with the scent of rain and exhaust. A line of black, armored SUVs idled at the curb like waiting beasts. Kyung-Tae didn't say a word as he handed me into the plush, darkened interior of the lead convoy. As the heavy door hissed shut, sealing out the sirens and the world I used to know, I turned to the man beside me. "I don't even know you," I whispered, my voice trembling. Kyung-Tae looked at me, his face half hidden in the shadows of the cabin. "You don't need to know me, Devyn. You just need to know that I'm the only reason you're not in a cage. Now, let's talk about my $50 million. The armored convoy ascended the winding, private roads of the Seoul hills, the city lights below shrinking into a sea of distant, uncaring stars. Inside the SUV, the air was pressurized with the scent of Kyung-Tae's sandalwood cologne and the silent, vibrating threat of his presence. He didn't look at me once. his profile a cold silhouette against the passing shadows, but the weight of his claim stayed heavy on my skin. When the vehicle finally hissed to a halt, we were standing before the Lim estate, a sprawling fortress of black basalt and soaring glass panels that seemed to bleed into the surrounding cliffs. It was a masterpiece of opulent dread, where traditional Korean architecture met the cold, clinical lines of a high-tech stronghold. It was beautiful, expensive, and terrifyingly remote. Kyung-Tae stepped out and waited, a silent command for me to follow. He led me through a foyer of polished obsidian where silent, stone-faced guards bowed in unison as we passed. We stopped in a central courtyard, the floor covered in thick, ivory-colored silk rugs that dampened the sound of my heels. "This is your home for the foreseeable future, Devyn," Kyung-Tae said, finally turning to face me. The moonlight caught the sharp angles of his jaw and the dark ink of the dragon on his neck. He stepped into my space, his height casting a long shadow over me. "It has everything you could require: fine clothes, the best food, and a security system that can detect a heartbeat a mile away." "You said you bought me a life," I said, my voice sounding small against the vastness of the stone walls. "But this is just a cage with better scenery." "It is a golden cage," he corrected, his voice a low, melodic rasp. He reached out, his fingers brushing the red velvet of my gown before tightening slightly on my arm. "And you remain in it until the ledger is balanced. $50 million, Devyn. That is the cost of the marriage license. That is the cost of the federal agents I turned away tonight." He leaned in, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that my breath hitched. "You are a forensic accountant. You know that debt doesn't disappear. It only changes hands. Your husband traded your life for his escape. I simply stepped in to collect the collateral. You will work, you will eat, and you will sleep under my roof. You are the most valuable asset I own, and I do not let my assets walk away until they have paid their dividends." He signaled to a maid waiting in the shadows, Madame Choi, her face a mask of cold judgment, to lead me away. As I walked toward the winding corridors of the West Wing, I realized that the math had shifted. I wasn't just a jilted bride or a framed professional anymore. I was a prisoner of the Syndicate, and my mind was the only currency that could buy back my soul. The silence of the estate's private library was heavy, the air chilled by a sophisticated climate control system that hummed like a heartbeat. I had shed the weight of the red velvet gown for a simple silk slip, but the skin beneath felt raw. Before me, a bank of high-resolution monitors glowed with a predatory blue light, casting long, sharp shadows against the mahogany bookshelves. Kyung-Tae stood in the doorway, a silent sentinel, draped in the shadows of the hall. He didn't speak. He simply watched as my fingers flew across the keyboard, dissecting the labyrinthine architecture of the Syndicate's offshore holdings. The numbers were my language, but tonight they were screaming. "He didn't just move the money," I whispered, the sound cracking the stillness. "He wove it into the core logic of your primary laundering servers." I isolated a strand of crimson coat that pulsed rhythmically against the black background of the screen. My stomach dropped. As a forensic accountant, I had spent my life hunting for errors, but this wasn't an error. It was a masterpiece of malice. "What am I looking at?" Kyung-Tae's voice was a low vibration behind me. He moved closer, the scent of sandalwood and cold rain reaching me before he did. "A dead man's trigger," I said, my voice trembling as the full scale of the betrayal became clear. "Zach didn't just steal the 50 million. He left a kill switch embedded in your encryption keys. It's tied to my unique forensic signature, the way I log in, the specific sequence of my keystrokes. He knew I'd be the one you forced to find it." I leaned back, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes like a digital fever. If I try to extract the funds without the bypass, or if anyone else attempts to breach the firewall, the code will execute a self-destruct sequence. It will scramble every account the Lim Syndicate owns. In 60 seconds, your entire empire will be reduced to untraceable, worthless data. The silence that followed was absolute. I felt the heat of Kyung-Tae's body as he leaned over the desk, his hand gripping the edge of the console until his knuckles turned white. The dragon on his neck seemed to tense in the flickering light. "He left me as a bomb," I realized, a cold wave of horror washing over me. "He knew you'd take me. He knew you'd make me work. And he made sure that the moment I tried to save myself by giving you what you wanted, I would be the one to pull the trigger on your destruction. Kyung-Tae turned to me, his dark eyes burning with a lethal, focused intensity. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at the woman he had claimed as a prize. He underestimated two things, Devyn. He underestimated my patience, and he underestimated your need for revenge. Diffuse it. Because if my world burns, I'll make sure you're the last thing I see in the flames. The descent into the sub-level of the estate was a transition from the world of ancient tradition to one of clinical, cutting-edge warfare. Kyung-Tae led me through a heavy reinforced door that hissed open only after a retinal scan and a biometric palm read. Inside, the space was a panoramic nerve center of glowing sapphire glass, haptic interfaces, and a server stack that vibrated with a low-frequency hum. This was the war room, the digital heart of the Lim Syndicate. "This is no longer a library for ghosts, Devyn," Kyung-Tae said, his voice echoing off the brushed steel walls. He gestured toward the central console, a sweeping arc of touch-sensitive glass that looked like a general's pulpit. "Every satellite we control, every encrypted banking channel, and every back door into the global financial grid is now at your fingertips. You said you needed a scalpel to defuse his trigger. I am giving you a theater of war." I stepped toward the console, my fingers hovering over the glass. As the screens ignited, the complexity of the data streams was staggering. It was a forensic accountant's version of a cathedral. I began to pull up the kill switch's architecture, expanding the code until it filled the room like a constellation of digital threats. Kyung-Tae stood at the edge of the light, his arms crossed over his chest, watching me. He wasn't looking at the screens. He was watching the way my eyes tracked the fluctuations in the code, the way my posture shifted from victim to predator. "My lieutenants think I should have traded you to the feds to buy silence," he remarked, the dragon on his neck catching the blue light. "They think the 50 million is the only thing that matters. They are fools. They see a dowry. I see a strategist who can bankrupt my enemies before they even know they're in a fight." "He thought my precision was a weakness," I said, my voice hardened as I isolated a packet of data. "He thought I was just a girl who liked spreadsheets. He forgot that the person who knows how the money is hidden is the only one who knows how to burn it all down." "I haven't forgotten," Kyung-Tae whispered, stepping into my personal space. The heat of him was a sharp contrast to the cold blue of the room. He reached out, his thumb grazing the line of my jaw with a possessive, unsettling intensity. "The feds want the fraudster. My family wants the cash. But I want the mind that can rebuild a kingdom from the ruins. Consider your debt suspended, Devyn. From this moment on, you aren't just my wife, you're my architect." The air in the room grew heavy, charged with a new, dangerous alliance. I looked at the red pulsing trigger on the screen and felt a cold, sharp thrill. The hunt for Zachary was no longer a matter of survival. It was an audit of blood, and I was going to make sure his accounts were permanently closed. The scent of expensive incense and aged paper hung heavy in the air of the estate's private tea room, a sharp departure from the sterile blue light of the war room. Madame Choi sat perfectly still, her spine a rigid line of iron against the silk cushions. Her eyes, milky with age but sharp as glass shards, tracked my every movement as I performed the formal pour. "You have the hands of a scholar," she murmured, her voice a dry rattle that seemed to vibrate against the porcelain cups. "But scholars are often too focused on the text to see the blood on the page." "I see the blood, madam," I replied, keeping my gaze steady. "I'm currently scrubbing it off your ledgers." She smiled, a thin, mirthless twist of her lips. She reached into the sleeve of her hanbok and produced an old, leather-bound notebook. The edges were frayed, the cover stained with the ghosts of ancient fingerprints. She slid it across the table toward me. As I opened it, the breath left my lungs in a sharp, painful gasp. The handwriting was unmistakable. The meticulous, slanted script belonged to my father, the man who had supposedly spent his life as a quiet, unassuming civil servant in a mid-level government office. "Your father didn't just understand numbers, Devyn," Madame Choi said, leaning forward until the scent of jasmine and sandalwood was suffocating. "He built the very foundation this syndicate stands on. He was the original architect of our shadows. When the purges happened 30 years ago, it wasn't a politician who saved the Lim family. It was a man with a fountain pen and a genius for invisibility. The room felt like it was tilting. My father had taught me how to find the rot in the books since I was 7 years old. He'd called it a game, a way to ensure I'd never be cheated. I realized now he hadn't been teaching me a trade. He'd been passing down a survival code. He ran to protect you, she continued, her gaze boring into mine. He tried to bury his past in a suburban life, hoping you'd never have to balance the scales. But blood has a way of returning to its source. Kyung-Tae didn't choose you by accident, Devyn. He has been looking for the architect's daughter since the day he took the throne. She reached out, her hand cold and surprisingly strong, clamping over my wrist. The test is simple. Your father ran when the fire got too hot. Will you be a coward like him and the man you married, or will you finish the work your father started? I looked past her, toward the silhouette of Kyung-Tae standing on the balcony, watching us through the glass. The marriage license wasn't just a legal shield or a price for $50 million. It was a reclamation. I wasn't a stranger brought into this world. I was a piece of the architecture finally returning home. I'm not my father, I said, my voice hardening into something lethal. And I'm definitely not Zachary's victim. If you want an architect, I'll build you a fortress no one can breach. The silk of my evening gown was the color of a fresh wound, a deep arterial red that shimmered under the crystalline light of the grand Seoul gala. It was a masterpiece of velvet trap design, engineered to make me the focal point of every hungry eye in the room. As we stepped off the elevator and into this suffocating cloud of expensive perfume and whispered scandals, Kyung-Tae's hand tightened on the small of my back. His touch was a tether, a reminder that while I was the bait, he was the hook. He's in the VIP lounge, West Wing, Kyung-Tae murmured, his voice a low vibration against my ear. He looked every bit the dark sovereign in a custom-tailored navy suit, the dragon on his neck appearing to writhe as he scanned the perimeter. The FBI has frozen his primary offshore accounts thanks to your digital breadcrumbs. He's desperate, Devyn. He's here to sell the encryption keys to a rival syndicate just to stay afloat. Then let's show him that the keys don't work anymore, I replied, my voice holding a lethal, steady edge. We moved through the crowd like a storm front, the socialites parting as they caught the predatory glint in Kyung-Tae's eyes. When we reached the terrace, I saw him. Zachary was holding a flute of champagne, laughing with a group of investors as if he hadn't left me at the altar to face a federal life sentence. But as his gaze drifted toward the entrance and landed on me, standing beside the most feared man in the country, his glass didn't just tremble. It shattered against the marble floor. Kyung-Tae didn't stop until we were inches from him. The silence that followed was heavy, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. Zachary's face went a sickly shade of gray. His eyes darted toward the exits like a cornered rat. You look surprised, Zachary, I said, stepping out from behind Kyung-Tae's shadow. Did you think I was currently being processed in a federal holding cell? Or did you think your kill switch would have erased the Lim Syndicate by now? Zachary, honey, listen, he stammered, his voice cracking with a cowardice that made my stomach turn. I did it for us. I was going to come back for you once the heat died down. Lim, you don't understand. She was part of it. Kyung-Tae's hand shot out, his fingers curling around Zachary's throat with a speed that made the room gasp. He leaned in, his face inches from the man who had tried to destroy me. Don't speak her name, Kyung-Tae hissed. You didn't just steal my money. You stole from the daughter of the architect. You're not a businessman, Zachary. You're a rounding error I'm about to delete. I watched as Zachary pleaded with his eyes, the man I thought I loved reduced to a pathetic, gasping wreck. I felt no pity, only a cold, forensic satisfaction. I reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his encrypted hardware wallet, the one containing the stolen millions. The audit is officially open, Zach, I whispered, and you're completely bankrupt. The adrenaline of the gala had faded into a heavy, pulsing silence by the time we returned to the estate. We were in Kyung-Tae's private sanctuary, a room of dark wood and the scent of rain, far removed from the cold blue glow of the war room. He had discarded his tuxedo jacket, the silk of his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, as he stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over a city he was currently bleeding dry. I stood by the door, the red velvet of my gown feeling like a second skin I wasn't ready to shed. Zachary is broken, I said softly, my voice cutting through the quiet. The accounts are draining. Why do you still look like a man who's losing a war? Kyung-Tae didn't turn, but I saw the muscles in his back tighten. Winning back money is just accounting, Devyn. It doesn't heal the breach in the foundation. He turned then, his eyes dark and unexpectedly raw. He walked toward me, and for the first time he didn't move with the dominant stride of a dawn, but with a weary, heavy purpose. He stopped inches from me and reached for his collar, pulling the fabric aside to reveal the full extent of the ink on his neck. It wasn't just a dragon. As he moved under the amber light of the desk lamp, I saw the creature's tail didn't just end, it dissolved into a series of jagged geometric lines, coordinates, elevations, and street-level grids that flowed down towards his chest. "Everyone sees a monster when they look at this," he whispered, his voice a low rasp. He took my hand, his skin burning against mine, and guided my fingers to the ink. "They think it's a warning, but your father didn't design a warning for me. He designed a blueprint." I traced the lines, my heart stuttering. My father's hand was everywhere, the same meticulous spacing he used in his ledgers. This wasn't just art, it was a map of the 3 districts, the territory the Lim family had lost during the purges, when Kyung-Tae was still a boy watching his father's empire burn. "These are the dead zones," Kyung-Tae said, his forehead resting against mine. The vulnerability in the gesture was more staggering than any display of violence. "The properties, the hidden docks, the tunnels, the paper records were destroyed, but your father etched the legacy into my skin so I could never forget what was stolen. He knew that one day I would need a mind like his to turn the ink back into stone and steel." He looked at me, and I saw a desperate, flickering hope behind the iron. The 50 million was supposed to be the first payment to buy back the northern docks. Zach didn't just steal money, he stole my history. I don't just want you to balance the books, Devyn. I want you to help me navigate this map. I want my kingdom back. The air in the room grew thick with a new, dangerous intimacy. I wasn't just his wife or his accountant. I was the only person alive who could read the map of his soul. I looked at the dragon on his chest and felt a fierce, protective fire ignite. "Then let's stop looking at the ink," I whispered. "It's time we reclaim the ground." The sky over the Incheon shipping yard was the color of a fresh bruise, heavy with the scent of salt and industrial rot. Rain lashed against the rusted shipping containers, a rhythmic drumming that masked the sound of the Lim Syndicate's approach. I sat in the back of the lead SUV, the blue light of my laptop reflecting in my eyes as I executed the final sweep. "I've pinned him," I said, my voice sounding distant even to myself. "He's trying to board a Panamanian freighter in berth 4. He's using a burner passport and the last of the laundered crypto I haven't frozen yet." Kyung-Tae checked the action on his pistol, the metallic click punctuating the hum of the engine. He didn't look back as he opened the door. "Stay here, Devyn. The audit is over. My men will handle the collection." "No," I said, snapping the laptop shut and stepping out into the cold, biting wind. The red silk of my dress was hidden under a heavy trench coat, but the fire I'd carried since the wedding reception was burning hotter than ever. "He didn't just steal from you. He used my name to build his gallows. I'm the one who pulls the lever." We moved through the labyrinth of steel crates, a phalanx of shadows. We found Zachary huddles near a stack of timber, his expensive suit ruined by the mud, his face illuminated by the desperate glow of a tablet. He was frantically trying to input a code, the very kill switch I had already dismantled and rerouted. "It won't work, Zach," I said, stepping into the circle of his frantic vision. He jumped, the tablet clattering to the wet concrete. "Devyn? Honey, thank God. You have to tell them I was doing this for us. I have a way out. We can be in Panama by morning." "There is no us," I said, stepping closer until I could see the cowardice etched in every line of his face. "There is only a massive deficit in your accounts. You're not a husband, Zach. You're a liability I'm about to write off." Kyung-Tae stepped beside me, his presence a dark, crushing weight. He drew a second handgun, a sleek, compact piece, and held it out to me. The dragon on his neck seemed to pulse with the rhythmic strobe of the harbor lights. "The Syndicate has already passed judgment," he said, his voice a low, lethal rasp. "But the wife? She gets the final audit." I took the weapon. The metal was ice cold, a heavy, grounding reality in my palm. I looked at the man who had abandoned me to a federal cage, the man who had turned my genius into a crime. For a moment, the world narrowed down to the sight of the gun and the heartbeat of the man who had betrayed me. I didn't hesitate. I didn't flinch. I aimed for the one thing he had left, his escape. The shot rang out, not into his chest, but into the hardware wallet in his hand, shattering the plastic and the digital millions inside into a million useless sparks. "You're not worth the paperwork of a murder, Zach. I whispered as the Syndicate guards closed in to drag him into the darkness. "I'd rather you live to see exactly how much I take from you." I handed the gun back to Kyung-Tae, my gaze unwavering. "The account is settled. Now, let's go take back the 3 districts." The cleansing rain of Incheon had washed the salt from my skin, but the cold, crystalline clarity in my mind remained. As we returned to the estate, the heavy basalt gates didn't feel like the jaws of a trap anymore. They felt like the perimeter of a kingdom. I walked through the foyer, my heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic tempo against the obsidian floor. I was no longer the girl in the red velvet gown, trembling at the altar of someone else's design. I was the one who had audited the wreckage and found a throne. Madame Choi stood at the base of the grand staircase. She didn't speak, but for the first time she lowered her head in a slow, deep bow of genuine deference. She wasn't acknowledging a captive or a debt collector. She was acknowledging the architect's daughter. I passed her without a word, heading straight for the war room where the blue light awaited. Kyung-Tae was already there, leaning over the central console. He had discarded his shirt, the full map of the 3 districts exposed across his back and shoulders. The ink seemed to glow with a new life. He looked up as I entered, and the predatory stillness in his eyes softened into something deeper, something that looked like respect. "The recovery is total, Devyn," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "The 50 million is back in the primary accounts. The feds have dropped the pursuit now that Zachary has been identified as the sole architect of the fraud. You are a free woman. The convoy is fueled and ready to take you back to your life." I walked to the console and placed my hand over the digital map of the city. I felt the low-frequency hum of the servers, the pulse of the power we had reclaimed together. I looked at the normal life I could return to, a life of spreadsheets for corporations that would never know my name, of safety that felt like a slow death. Then I looked at the man who had seen the lethal genius behind my precision. "My father didn't build this for me to be free of it, Kyung-Tae," I said, my voice steady and dark. "He built it so I would know how to run it. I'm not going back to a cubicle." I tapped the screen, initiating the first phase of the acquisition for the northern docks. The data streams turned from a defensive red to a triumphant pulsing green. "The debt is cleared, but the expansion is just beginning. You have the muscle to take the territory, but you need me to ensure you never lose it again. You need a matriarch who knows exactly where every cent and every body is buried." Kyung-Tae walked around the console, his hand coming to rest on the nape of my neck, his thumb grazing the line of my jaw. "And what do you want, Devyn?" "I want the world that was promised to my father," I whispered, leaning into his touch. "And I want to watch it burn and rebuild it with you." He pulled me into him, his kiss tasting of victory and dark promises. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise over Seoul, but inside the fortress of silk and steel, the reign of the new matriarch had just begun.